Hi, welcome to this evening's debate on rent regulation. My name is Aaron Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Smith Family Foundation. This evening's event at Fordham Law School is co-sponsored by the Federalist Society, the American Constitution Society, and the Housing Advocacy Project. We have the honor of having Professor Boddie from Fordham Law moderating this evening. Prior to joining the Fordham faculty, she was an Associate Director for Litigation at the NAACP. Prior to that, she was at Fried Frank. She was a recipient of the first Fried Frank NAACP Fellowship. Prior to receiving the fellowship, she clerked for the Honorable Robert Carter of the United States District Court. She's a cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School. She's also a cum laude graduate of Yale College and has a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Please welcome Professor Boddie.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening. It's delightful to be here amongst this very august body. I'm not a native New Yorker, but I understand that rent regulation has always been a subject of intense controversy and interest in New York City. This debate took on an added fervor and added intensity with the recent announcement that MetLife, who is the owner of Peter Cooper Village and Stuyvesant Town, was proposing to sell its housing complex to a developer. These housing complexes are home to around 25,000 tenants. Therefore, they are an important source of affordable housing in New York City and have been, as I understand it, for over 50 years. In addition, Starrett City, which is a federally subsidized rental complex in Brooklyn, is for sale, though I understand that the Department of Housing and Urban Development has blocked a recent bid over concerns that the new buyer would not be able to maintain the affordability of the housing complex in light of the proposed price. So these events raise a number of questions about the long-term viability of affordable housing in New York City, or at least housing for middle-income people. And they also raise a series of normative questions that I hope we will touch on this evening concerning rent regulation. Who benefits from rent regulation, from deregulation? What are the consequences of the trend toward deregulation? And what would happen if this trend were reversed? Can New York be an affordable city? Should it be an affordable city? So to help us wrestle with these very thorny questions, we have Craig Gurian and Peter Salins, who both bring an impressive set of credentials to this discussion. Craig Gurian is a scholar in residence at the Stein Center for Law and Ethics here at Fordham Law School. He has taught courses as an adjunct professor on housing discrimination. He also is the executive director of the Anti-Discrimination Center of Metro New York. He is a longtime practitioner of civil rights law, and among other things, he is the author of Let Them Rent Cake, George Pataki Market Ideology, and the Attempt to Dismantle Rent Regulation in New York. Peter Salins, who is to my far left, is a professor at Stony Brook University. He is a senior fellow of the Manhattan Institute Center for Civic Innovation. Among his many other bona fides, he is a director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council of New York. He is the author of Scarcity by Design, The Legacy of New York City's Housing Policies, as well as The Ecology of Housing Destruction, Economic Effects of Public Intervention in the Housing Market. I have been given a very detailed set of instructions about how the timing for this event is supposed to work. So you'll forgive me for very much micromanaging this process, but I suppose that's my role as the moderator for this event. Each person will have 10 minutes to give his opening remarks, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal. And it's my understanding that Craig Gurian is to go first. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boddie. I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight. Remember hearing President Bush explain that the way to solve the healthcare crisis was cutting back on the gold-plated health insurance people have been enjoying? He must be living in a different country. I, for one, am much less concerned about too much health care than I am about the ever greater numbers of people living in fear and insecurity without adequate insurance. In the same vein, the President thinks that tax cuts for the wealthy are the all-season solution. Good when the economy is humming, good when it's sputtering, good even as a response to dreary winter weather. It's the triumph of ideology over reality. In fact, income and wealth inequality have continued to grow. The squeeze on the middle class gets worse. Only the priests of market theology are surprised that people don't understand how good they have it. Well, there's a local branch of this business above all club, and its most active members are those who have worked very successfully in the last several years to undermine rent regulation. Their promise: give landlords more leeway and you'll get more affordable apartments. The reality: it was all a con job. There are fewer regulated apartments, rents are higher, and more people have the insecurity of knowing that their next apartment won't come with the right to a lease renewal. In fact, the New York Sun, no friend to rent-regulated tenants, recently estimated that hundreds of thousands of apartments will soon face deregulation. The way things have played out over the last 10 years should come as no surprise. Governor Pataki and his allies had 3 goals. 1, bringing an immediate windfall to landlords by permitting large rent increases. 2, reducing the number of regulated units by having deregulation triggers that over time gobble up more and more units, even those apartments that in 1997 rent for far less than $2,000 a month. And 3rd, diminish political support enjoyed by rent regulation as a side effect of cutting the number of people helped by rent regulation, the same goal that President Bush had with his privatized Social Security scheme. Since 1997, even a count that the Rent Guidelines Board itself acknowledges is incomplete shows that more than 120,000 rent-stabilized units have been lost, including more than 50,000 that have been removed by the current version of vacancy decontrol. In fact, every time an apartment renting for as little as $1,200 a month is vacated by a longtime tenant, a landlord can buy that apartment out of regulation for less than $20,000 in claimed capital improvements. The range of rents has also changed dramatically. The percentage of stabilized apartments renting for $1,000 or more has doubled since 1999 to over 30% of the total. The percentage of stabilized apartments renting for more than $1,250, in other words, those ripe for deregulation upon a single vacancy, has also doubled since '99, up to 15% of all rent-stabilized units. Data show that more than 4 in 10 rent-stabilized tenants already pay more than 35% of their household income on rent, an amount generally considered to be unaffordable. Governor Pataki's deregulation path was the wrong path, and it was founded on a false assumption. The basic premise of those who believe or claim they believe in market theology, the idea that the market will work efficiently to achieve results that are in the public interest, is fundamentally misplaced. Markets are simply not designed to do some things. That's why, for example, very few of you will have heard of the cholesterol-lowering drug niaspan. It's wonderfully effective, but since it's just a time-release version of the mineral niacin, there are not huge profits to be had. Since profit centers are where markets gravitate, you'll continue to see many more ads for Viagra than for a life-prolonging medicine. A landlord having the choice of taking a deregulated unit and making a modest profit by catering to working-class tenants, or taking that same unit and going as upscale as possible to maximize profit, is not going to take a long time to decide. That is the way markets operate, without the design or inclination to meet societal needs on their own. Market theologians like to pretend that there is a free market. This is the same argument that was made before wage and hour laws were enacted. The employer and the worker were equally free at the moment of contract. The employer was free to engage the worker at 25 cents an hour, or if the worker refused, to hire any of 1,000 other people willing to work at any price. The worker was free to accept the exploitation wages and just as free not to have any work at all and starve. Wage and hour laws were passed precisely because it came to be understood that a more important human value was served by creating freedom from the unregulated market. In the rental housing context, the idea of a free market is just as absurd a conceit. Housing is not an optional item, like a new toaster or a new Maserati or tickets to the hottest Broadway play. You can't just decide to forego housing. Tenants have neither the information nor the organization to have real negotiating power in respect to the rents that landlords want to charge. Where demand is high, and national and regional population growth mean that demand is likely to remain very high, landlords are in the driver's seat with nothing built into the market to temper their desire to maximize profit. The Pataki march to deregulation has worsened the imbalance. The family who needs a larger apartment is stuck. They know that the rent-stabilized apartment they reside in is their last. And we can't forget that deregulation has substantial non-economic costs. Loss of community, loss of friends, loss of neighbors, loss of a city where the middle class has a place. The free marketeers make no allowance for human and societal factors when they calculate what is supposedly efficient and what is not. Here's one of their big gripes about regulated tenants. It's awful. People just insist on living in apartments that are too big for too long a time and in neighborhoods where they just have no right to be. What a double standard. The deregulators have no problem with owners of apartments living in the neighborhoods they want or having enough space for the grandchildren to visit. It's just where tenants are concerned that these values count for nothing. I happen to think that we need to do more to nourish economic and racial diversity in each and every neighborhood, not less. I turn now to a little talked about but crucial problem of deregulation. Everyone, renter or owner, wants to have security. You meet your obligations, you get to continue to live in your home. You contract for services, you continue to get them. Not under deregulation. Tenants lose the protection against service reductions they enjoy under rent regulation. More fundamentally, they are completely at the mercy of the landlord in respect to whether they get a lease renewal, and if so, upon what basis. That in turn means that they know if you demand anything, like regular heat, hot water, or repairs, you're going to be out. Deregulation advocates think that that's an appropriate balance of power. I think that's fundamentally unfair. Everyone sitting in this room and watching on TV tonight knows that landlords have had a very long feast at the expense of tenants, and our new governor has the obligation to change that. Notwithstanding this, you're about to hear from Professor Salins about the terrible problems of struggling landlords and greedy tenants, and about the need to bow to the will of a well-meaning and unstoppable market. As you do so, consider some alternatives. That perhaps the pursuit of maximum profit should not be the one value that trumps all others. That perhaps we should have a balanced approach that recognizes other values: family, neighborhood, economic and racial integration, a person's security and ease in knowing that he can remain in his home. And finally, that there is not a single path that we are obliged to follow as a matter of natural law or inevitability. We retain the opportunity and the responsibility to decide how we want to shape things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Good evening. Just for the record, since Mr. Gurian is sort of anticipating what I'm going to say, I don't consider myself a market theologian. I have no stake in this fight. I am neither tenant nor landlord. What I am is a social scientist, and I bring to the analysis the perspective of a social scientist, not a theologian, free market or otherwise. Cutting directly to the heart of tonight's debate question, which is, should Governor Spitzer enhance or phase out New York's rent regulation system, my answer is that it is long past time to end New York's ancient and anachronistic regime of rent regulation, and it can only be ended, it cannot be enhanced. Let me give you the current context. In the length and breadth of this nation, with over 124 million dwellings, New York's nearly 1.1 million regulated units are practically the only survivors of this outdated mechanism for maintaining supposedly affordable housing. A few California cities, notably San Francisco, Berkeley, and Santa Monica, still have rent controls, but they are being phased out through a statewide vacancy decontrol measure in California. Within a decade, New York City will be the nation's lonely rent regulation dinosaur unless we rejoin the rational housing markets of the rest of the country. Getting to the heart of why Governor Spitzer should end rent regulation, as Governor Rockefeller did 36 years ago, an act undone by his temporary successor Malcolm Wilson in a vain attempt to win over New York City renters in his doomed bid for election in his own right. First, it depresses the rate of new housing development. Second, it provides absolutely no affordability premium to the vast majority of New York's middle and lower income families. And third, while it offers a marginal discount to affluent older renters in the better neighborhoods of Manhattan, it actually raises the cost of good housing even for all other affluent Manhattanites. The most important underlying point, and I think it gets to the heart of what Craig said just a few minutes ago, the most important underlying point I want to make before I go any further is that rent control is not an issue pitting tenants against landlords. Rent regulation does not help tenants, and it does not harm landlords. How it doesn't help tenants, I will get to in the remainder of my talk. But the reason it doesn't harm landlords is because its effects are already capitalized in the price that landlords pay for the buildings that they buy or develop. Landlords are businessmen, after all, and no businessman has an intention of going into or staying in a losing business. So let's talk about the basic rationale for keeping rent regulation. It is supposed to make the city's housing more affordable. The truth is that the majority of New York City renters, especially those of lower income living in marginal neighborhoods outside of Manhattan below 110th Street, receive absolutely no rental discount. This fact has been well researched and documented in a 2003 study by Henry Polakowski, a highly regarded MIT economist and housing analyst. His study actually calculates the difference between current regulated and potential market rents in every New York City neighborhood. Only in Manhattan's better neighborhoods, inhabited by residents with incomes substantially higher than the citywide median, was there a measurable or substantial rent regulation discount. Not only does rent regulation only offer selective benefits by location and income, it offers only selective benefits by other household characteristics like age and family status. To get the maximum benefits from the regulatory system, you have to stay put for many years. Thus, young families, either those just starting out or the hundreds of thousands of young families that move to New York from other parts of the region, the nation, or abroad, A, won't be able to find a regulated apartment, and this is even before we did any kind of deregulation, and B, if they do find one, it will not offer any affordability discount. Further, since the system mainly favors households who stay put, and the longer they stay put, the more favored they are, the system confers its greatest spatial benefits, that is, the largest apartments, in many cases to the city's smallest households. So here we have a regulatory system justified by the need to make housing affordable for the majority of the city's households, a large share of whom are middle or lower income families, often with children, that confers almost all of its measurable benefits on households that are affluent, small, and usually childless. But the irony is that even this cohort doesn't get much, if any, benefit in the end. Why? Because the Polakowski study calculated the extent of a rent regulation discount that is itself a result of the city's regulation-fragmented housing market. The effect of rent regulation is to distort the citywide housing market, putting enormous price pressure on the remaining unregulated units, either in the owner-occupied sector or that segment of the rental sector comprised of newer or unregulated apartments. Most of this stock is pitched at exactly the same demographic group whose luckiest members occupy rent-discounted quality apartments in good neighborhoods. So here's one of the fundamental points made by virtually all economists, a group that to its last member, including even Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist, detests rent regulation. In a well-functioning housing market like that of Chicago, say, the rents of occupied apartments and ones available for rent, accounting for differences in location, size, and quality, will be the same. However, in a housing market fragmented by rent regulation like New York's, there is a wide disparity between the rents of occupied regulated units and their available for rent counterparts, most especially in the city's desirable neighborhoods. I looked at the current pattern of rents in other large American cities. Even with 2/3 of New York's rental units and half of its entire housing stock, either regulated or subsidized, New York's median rent level is either the same as or higher than that of every other American city. But in all other cities, with the exception of still regulated San Francisco, the median rents of occupied apartments and the asking rents of available apartments are identical or nearly identical. In New York, there is a vast disparity between the two. Therefore, we can conclude that in the absence of rent regulation, not only would most rents not rise, probably a majority would fall, especially in the best buildings and neighborhoods. Bottom line, as the system stands right now, the lower income family households in Upper Manhattan and the outer boroughs get absolutely no benefit from the current rent regulation system. The lucky older and more established members of the rental upper and upper middle classes get a monthly rent windfall in today's market of approximately $500 to $600 a month. All other members of even this group, newly arrived from the suburbs or out of town, pay a monthly premium of $1,000 or more than they would otherwise have to for the privilege of living in Manhattan. And wrapping up, let me posit two things: what the city's rents would look like if rent regulation disappeared, and how I propose we make it disappear. Right now, rents at the margin, that is for new market entrants in Manhattan's better neighborhoods, run approximately $3 to $4 a square foot per month. Rent-regulated tenants in the same areas pay roughly two-thirds of that. I predict that within 5 years of substantial deregulation, A, market unregulated rents in the city's best buildings and neighborhoods would be at most 10% higher than current regulated levels and at least 30% below current market levels. In the non-fashionable areas, not only would deregulated rents not rise at all, they might actually fall because the rush of new development in these areas would put most existing apartments in competition with a host of newer, higher quality units brought to market. Final point, how do we get there from here? I have never advocated instant total deregulation. I have always proposed, as California has already enacted, vacancy decontrol. Under such a regime, all current tenants are protected and the housing market gradually re-equilibrates. For vacancy decontrol to work, however, the rules of lease succession must be strictly applied. When an existing tenant moves, no one, not even a close family member, can take over the regulated lease. How long would the adjustment be? Probably less than a decade. First, as I just indicated, there would be a wave of new private, unsubsidized middle-income housing in the outer boroughs that would take much pressure off the citywide housing market. Second, once regulated tenants in desirable buildings realize that their leases have no value as a form of property right, moves from existing regulated units would gradually accelerate. What does all of this mean with respect to the sale of Stuyvesant Town and Starrett City? With the artificial housing market and submarkets generated by rent regulation a thing of the past, it would make absolutely no difference who owned these developments. They would have to be worth buying on the basis of current market conditions and not on a gamble that the regulatory environment could be changed or manipulated. Thank you.
Well, it's great. You always get to learn something, and tonight I learned that landlords really don't care whether rent regulation continues. It doesn't really help them or hurt them so much. We, of course, have heard the promise about rents will fall before. That drum was beat by every editorial board supporting deregulation in 1997. And of course, that's not what happens. I'm afraid, with apologies to any economists in the audience, sometimes economists lose a little real-life rationality. It's not as if landlords look around and say, we'll just appeal to everyone who is here. To the extent that there are people to be attracted to the city at higher incomes, that's what they will do. To the extent that people are squeezed out into other neighborhoods, poorer people will be squeezed. That has very significant impacts. Now, I just want to be clear about one thing. Deregulators are ideologically opposed and would be ideologically opposed even if every protected tenant had a household income of only $20,000. In fact, 2/3 of rent-regulated tenants have household incomes below $50,000. Fully 80% have household income under $70,000. More than 2/3 of the units are outside Manhattan. And I thought that it was a good idea to keep middle class and upper middle class families in New York without being squeezed to the bone. These same opponents will scream flight at the slightest tax increase. We're going to lose our tax base. These enormous kind of rent increases that come with deregulation and the vacancy bonuses that landlord gets are a much heavier tax. And the most important piece because this debate, although you haven't heard the word yet, it's about power. Who wields power? Do landlords get to wield all power? This argument about wealthy tenants is, hear me, a fraudulent diversion. If there were a true concern about where the benefits are flowing, there'd be a proposal to have a surcharge on those tenants, perhaps to create an affordable housing construction fund. Or perhaps there'd be a proposal to say, you can't have that regulated apartment anymore. We're going to give that to a Fordham Law School graduate who's struggling to make ends meet with all of the student loans she has to make. But you never hear that proposal. The point is an excuse to deregulate the apartment. The only thing that does is make it unaffordable for all but the wealthy forever. Regulation does not deter building. Landlords, for a very, very long time in New York City, have had the ability to build without regulation so long as they don't have their hand out for some kind of tax or zoning benefit. And in terms of freezing the market, you'd never hear that said to the owner of a single-family home. In fact, it turns out that rent-stabilized tenants are more mobile than owners of their homes. There are other issues which we'll be able to talk about if you want to deal with creating greater fluidity in neighborhoods. One is dealing with the incredibly high level of residential segregation in New York and the barriers that creates. Another is dealing with the ever-increasing number of deregulated apartments. That's what gives a person pause to move. I can't get out of my regulated apartment, and I can't afford the $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a month. I will say this. I have never suggested that rent regulation is the solution to all of New York's housing problems. The issue of federal involvement has to be addressed. The issue of limitless growth. Our mayor apparently is not satisfied with 44 million visitors. He thinks we need to go to 50 million visitors. Those are issues that need to be addressed. But the fact that rent regulation doesn't solve all of the problem doesn't mean that it doesn't deal with some of the problem. And the only thing that deregulation creates is more profit, not more land, not more affordable apartments.
Well, you know, the problem I have in these debates is that we're dealing with fundamentally different premises. Essentially, the approach that Craig takes and all of the proponents of rent regulation is anti-economistic. Now, you know, as I said earlier, I am neither a tenant nor a landlord, and I have no financial stake in this debate one way or the other. But I am a social scientist, and even though my grounding is not entirely in economics, an important part of it is, you either believe in economics or you don't, but not believing in economics is like not believing in physics or not believing in chemistry. You can say it's nonsense, I think the law of gravity is stupid, and there's no reason why things should fall to the ground if you let go of them. But I think that, you know, at least in terms of this audience, I'm pretty confident that if I asked you whether you believed in the laws of physics, probably the vast majority would say yes. I don't know how this audience would feel about the laws of economics, but they are well proven. Now, just in terms of this particular issue, if it really were so easy that rent regulation could be imposed and actually create a significant order of benefit. And given that tenants, as voters, outnumber landlords in every jurisdiction in America, the whole country would be rent regulated. It is not. Practically nothing in America left is rent regulated. Furthermore, if keeping the price of housing down could be done through force majeure, through regulation, why not get the price of food down? Why not get the price of automobiles down? Why not get the price of clothing down? We've tried that. We had a brief period during World War II of overall price controls. Countries here and there around the world try it, usually with disastrous consequences. Venezuela is trying it right now, and food shortages that didn't exist in Venezuela are suddenly appearing. That you cannot, whether you dislike the laws of economics or not, you ignore them at your peril. Now, the other point I want to make with respect to the rebuttal and Craig's recent comments, he wasn't listening to at least one point I made, or at least he didn't believe me. I realize that most stabilized tenants are not wealthy, and I realize that most of them live in non-fashionable neighborhoods. And the point I made is they are not seeing one nickel's worth of benefit from the current system. That now, as long as if you have a selective removal, in other words, a particular tenant in an otherwise regulated market is deprived of their apartment, yes, maybe there would be an opportunity for the rent to go up. But if the entire market were deregulated, it would be absolutely not true. Now, again, it's one of those counterfactuals impossible to prove. Now, one of the things that would happen as far as the wicked landlords that Craig and a lot of other people on this issue are so concerned about, that the price that the current generation of landlords has paid for their buildings builds in the economic assumptions of rent regulation. Yes, there might be a very brief window or generation of windfall beneficiaries as we transition from a regulated system to an unregulated system. But very quickly, the prices that owners would have to pay for the newly deregulated buildings would reflect their new set of rents. Actually, the price might not actually go up that much, because my guess is that the rents that they would actually be able to realize won't go up that much. But whatever the facts are, landlords, the new generation of landlords, will have to pay what they need to pay. And the final point as far as the wicked owner-occupants, and I do confess to being one of those. I do own my house, and I've owned it for a long time, and therefore I'm guilty of what Craig was implying. But actually, home ownership is probably one of the most stabilizing phenomena that we possibly can have in the city. New York has an unusually low level of home ownership, even compared to highly dense inner cities in America, because of rent regulation. Probably one of the many different adjustments in the market that would take place if we eventually ended rent regulation would be a fairly substantial increase in home ownership in the city by all social classes and income classes and ethnic groups, and I personally think that would be a good thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those remarks. We'll now take about 20 minutes. I'm going to pose some questions to our esteemed participants and ask them to respond. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So I guess the first question that I have, I didn't hear either of you discuss, I guess, one of the common criticisms of rent control or rent regulation, which is the impact on the quality of the housing stock. And I was wondering, perhaps Professor Salins, if you think that that's a legitimate argument, and then Professor Gurian, if you could respond to him.
Well, I again, being a firm believer in the validity of most of the rules of economics, when you have vigorous competition in any market, you improve quality. Cars have gotten better, clothing has gotten better, TVs have gotten better, computers have gotten better. And in most of America, housing has gotten better. In a highly competitive market, housing producers or the owners of rental housing will compete with each other to capture the market. In most markets, it's the consumer, not the supplier, that is sovereign. The biggest fear that almost every businessman has, whether businessman owns a food store, a restaurant, a theater, whatever, is not having enough consumers. What we have in New York City is the reverse. Because we have a tightly constrained housing market, the supplier is sovereign. The only way we're going to move from supplier sovereignty to consumer sovereignty, which is what would increase the quality, apropos the question you raised, the only way we're going to go from supplier sovereignty to consumer sovereignty is to have an open competitive market. And by the way, the housing market, when it is truly competitive, is no piece of cake for its participants. Look at Florida, look at many parts of the country, look at the supposedly collapsing housing market in many parts of the country. It can be a very punishing market. In a way, it is not a coincidence that New York has been spared the collapse of the housing bubble. Maybe that is an indirect benefit of having rent regulation. But because the market is so tight, it hasn't collapsed at the rate as it has in the more open competitive markets. But the price you pay for that, maybe it's nice not to have a collapsing housing market, but the price you pay for that is that there is an erosion of quality, and the housing stock in New York is not as good as it might be if we had an open competitive market.
Well, you can't just snap your fingers and have an open competitive market. And you can't deregulate housing and have an open competitive market because it won't be competitive. I thought the car example was a very useful one. In some ways, cars have gotten better. Let me cite 3: seatbelts, airbags, gas mileage. None of those were generated by competitors in the market. All of those were generated by government regulation imposed on a market that, whatever its economics credentials, didn't seem to know that it was in the public benefit and only belatedly learned that it could be marketed. As far as housing quality is concerned, this is another thing where one needs to open one's mind to different possibilities. In the early 20th century, the open competitive market meant that there was very little light or air that was available in tenements. New York changed the law. Landlords, and I cite this in my article, are very straightforward, is saying, in rent-stabilized buildings, we're not going to put in more than we have to. That isn't an argument for deregulation. That's an argument for getting the city, which has become pretty serious about its anti-smoking enforcement, to be serious about enforcing the provisions of the housing code. There are hundreds of thousands of violations that are out there, and the law should be enforced. Saying that it will all work by magic if you just let landlords do what they want hasn't worked. It won't work. Landlords say that it won't work. I just need to add one point on this question of security of tenure, because it's very important to understand that there are economic benefits to regulation in terms of stability of communities, in terms of New York remaining affordable, but there are also non-economic benefits. The ability to be able to know you're going to live in the same place 4 years from now, that's important. The ability to know that your adult child that has taken care of you through a terminal illness is not herself going to be thrown into the street. That's what people all over the country take for granted. And indeed, in different places, at different times, there are different slices of property rights or property entitlements. This is what I meant in my opening remarks. We need to make a decision as a democratic society as which rights we value more, or whether we just want to say the market is going to do what it's going to do. That latter approach was very effective as a marketing technique in 1997 because there was an aura of inevitability created around the idea of some form of regulation, of deregulation. People could agree or disagree with me on the ultimate answer, but let's at least agree that it's our decision and we have to take responsibility for it.
Professor Salins, what about Professor Gurian's point about the analogy about cars? That is, that if that we need a certain amount of regulation, because if we allow the free market just to operate on its own accord, that it's going to invite certain socially undesirable outcomes. And here we have maybe a particularly vulnerable population that would be disadvantaged by deregulation. How do you
Well,
respond?
first of all, even absent rent regulation, we have plenty of other regulations in the housing and development market. The building code in New York City is more onerous than the building code anywhere else in New York State, anywhere else in the United States. We have restrictive zoning regulations. We have restrictive development regulations. And as far as what you might call consumer product safety, which, variants of that are involved in the automobile analogy that Craig mentioned, so everybody thinks that they're reasonable, and obviously we're going to have fire exits and safe materials and so forth. So I have no question about that. But quality is not just safety, and in a car, quality isn't just seat belts and good gas mileage. That if you are at all an auto buff, as I am, and you read the auto magazines and you're interested in cars, I mean, there are so many levels of quality and so many issues that you couldn't possibly regulate. You could not have the government regulate a high-quality product. You can get the government to regulate away dangerous things, really undesirable things. You cannot get the government to regulate quality. But I keep on getting back to one point that gnaws at me in terms of Craig's presentation and, again, my adversaries in these kinds of debates that I've encountered in the past. If it's so easy to repeal the laws of economics, why don't we do it across the board? The fact that we are such a lonely outpost of rent regulation in America, when, as I said, tenants outnumber owners of property in every single jurisdiction in the United States by a large margin. Nor is it just a matter that the owners are making campaign contributions. I have almost posited, much to the annoyance of members of the owner community in New York, that they may actually be secretly the ones that want to keep the system afloat. The very tight market that it creates, at least for the ones that are well capitalized and well positioned, probably have a more secure franchise in their housing than they would have in an open, untrammeled market. If it's so easy to legislate prices, why not do it across the board? The occasions when we've done this, like I said, the Second World War is the most prominent, but there was a brief moment, actually, even in the Nixon administration, if you remember, when he was trying to stimulate the economy to assure his reelection, and inflation was already at the edge of sort of the danger zone, that he thought he could combine fiscal stimulus with price controls. It's never worked out. So why we in New York believe in this particular market, we don't regulate any other market in New York, we don't keep clothing prices low, we don't keep theater prices low. Why should people have to spend a fortune to go to the theater? Why? It can cost you $70, $80, $100 to go. Why not mandate that theater tickets cost no more than $25? Craig would say, well, then the theaters will all close. Well, that's the point.
Professor Gurian, would you like to respond to that question about price controls in particular?
Well, maybe we should make a start on restoring people's ability to have a home. And then after we complete that work with the help of the new governor, we could move on to a discussion of what to do with theater tickets. The two points that, and I'm afraid we will be going just back and forth over and over again. Professor Salins keeps on talking about the laws of economics. Well, the laws don't come down from the sky. They exist within particular parameters. One of them would be, I thought you would agree, the ability to have a truly competitive market with both sides of the transaction having some leverage. Being able to say my leverage is moving out of New York City, losing my job, going away from all of my family is not a lot of leverage. You just saw the Sam Roberts piece in the Times about the median income of the growing number of white non-Hispanic toddlers, not the toddlers' income, their household income, which is now up to $270,000. That's the median income. There are decisions within the laws of economics, as Professor Salins described them, and actually other laws that can moderate the effects of untrammeled markets that we need to think about.
I just want to follow up, Professor Salins, on another point that you made. If I understood your argument correctly, I understood you to say that in the absence of rent regulation, most rents would fall over the long term. Is that correct? And I guess one thing that I'm trying to reconcile is that I read that the Peter Cooper Village and Stuyvesant Town housing complex actually sold for, I guess, 10% above what MetLife had asked for it. And in light of your observation that landlords sort of capitalize the effects of price in what they pay for their housing complexes that they purchase, I guess I'm trying to reconcile that, because the way I would interpret those facts would be to suggest that the buyer of this housing complex understands that it's going to be profitable over the long term, which would suggest that they would find some way to abandon rent regulation. I was just wondering if you could respond to that, and if I'm correct in my.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems we have, and the reason these debates tend to get a little bit sterile after a while, is because, again, it is almost impossible to have a controlled experiment. It would be wonderful if we have all these virtual reality things in other respects, and in architecture and urban design, we can actually simulate environments and see what they would look like, and then see if we would like them, and then if we don't, we can simulate something else. We can't quite yet simulate, accurately what New York would look like under these different kinds of schemes. But what I'm fairly confident of is this, that in the current environment, where real, complete deregulation is not anywhere near, a prospect, where everybody is gambling on a maintenance of the status quo with only marginal deregulation, there is a huge arbitrage or rent-seeking potential on the part of developers. So essentially what, the purchasers of Stuyvesant Town may be counting on is the system remaining largely intact, but some portion of their stock being free of it. So they get the benefits of the high rents at the margin. Remember now, the fundamental construct that I want to introduce to this group is that in a regulated market, there are two rent levels you're dealing with. The rent level in the regulated stock and the rent level in the marginal available stock. That creates a huge arbitrage potential, and maybe, just maybe, buyers of these big complexes figure that if they can sort of build in on that arbitrage, they can make a profit. My notion of a less costly housing market, a more competitive and a more affordable housing market depends ultimately on dismantling the system. If we don't dismantle it, people will play games. Tenants will play games, and some owners and potential owners will play games.
So, Professor Gurian, if you could respond.
Just very quickly. On Stuytown, of course, it's pretty straightforward what the purchasers are hoping for. Whether they'll get it or not is, of course, unclear. They're looking not at the margin, the difference between regulated and unregulated. They're looking to try to capture a luxury market, and what they need to do in order to achieve that is get out a lot of existing tenants. What we need to talk about, either in this debate or as the debate goes forward, is the fact that there are very important additional factors at play when it comes to housing markets and the economy of New York in general. It is not as though there is just regulation and deregulation. It's been treated that way because the government at all levels has been a relatively modest player in introducing competition into the market in the form of more units. We have gone through a period of time that has now lasted over 25 years where the federal government has entirely abandoned its responsibility in terms of creating housing. So those other factors are important. And to answer the question, why not more? Landlords do have a lot of influence in this town. I mean, the real estate board just whispered, and we don't yet have a law prohibiting landlords from discriminating on the basis of someone being a survivor of domestic violence. That's a reality of power. I think it would be a very good idea for us to try democracy in New York, and that's why the Erstat law should be repealed so that New York City has an opportunity to decide, based on laws, economic and others, what it wants to do for its future and what kind of city it wants to be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That concludes at least the formal part of this presentation.